Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. Due to the popularity of the NES in North America, over the years on the information superhighway I have seen plenty of uploads about this Ghostbusters game. But what I have seen less coverage of regarding this title are videos highlighting the 1984 Apple II and Commodore 64 original versions of the game, or the ambitious Atari VCS Port, or the well-refined Master System porting of the game that offered a huge upgrade to what came before it. Considering that traditionally the retro gaming community on YouTube have always been pretty Nintendo-centric, it is no surprise that many of the more interesting versions of Ghostbusters have been more overlooked, as they simply were not owned by NES gamers. Rather than analysing this game and its many ports today, instead we are going to be focusing on the real Ghostbusters game, the very title that was most commonly owned by gamers here in Europe, that can be enjoyed both in the arcades and on many different home computer formats. So today we are going to be taking a deep dive look at this game and discuss whether or not this really was the real Ghostbusters game. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the mad story of the real Ghostbusters arcade game. A game sold on a lie. Yeah! In 1984, Ghostbusters hit cinemas. The American supernatural comedy film written by Dan Aykroyd and Harold Ramis, who would also co-star in said movie alongside Bill Murray and Ernie Hudson as the Ghostbusters. The movie, that is focused around a group of eccentric parapsychologists starting a ghost catching business in New York City, was based on Aykroyd's own fascination with spirituality. Ghostbusters was revolutionary in that it was the first comedy film to employ expensive special effects. In fact, due to this project's uniqueness, many people who worked on the film were skeptical that it could turn a profit. A $30 million budget for a comedy movie back then was just unheard of. Doubters were quickly proven wrong though when the movie would not only receive critical acclaim, Ghostbusters would become a cultural phenomenon. No movie in history had ever mixed comedy, action and horror together so well, and the movie would help Bill Murray become a superstar. That year, Ghostbusters would set the record as the highest grossing comedy of all time. Keeping this success in mind, like anything, Ghostbusters would quickly become a multi-million-dollar franchise, which would result in toys, comic books, clothing, and everything else you would expect from such a cash cow. Amongst all of this, an animated television show would be launched, which is how I and many other young children would first come into contact with the Ghostbusters brand down the line. In fact, I at first thought they made a live-action Ghostbusters movie simply off of the back of how good this show was. But who could blame me? I was not born until 1986, 2 years after the original movie came out. The TV programme that would run for 7 successful series between 1986 and 1991, interestingly, was known as the Real Ghostbusters, which as I grew older would assume was a name that was used to further differentiate this product from the movies. But later on in life I would discover that the name the show received would actually be for a completely different reason than I first inferred. It turns out that this is because there was already an animated show known as The Ghostbusters that was released earlier by Filmation in 1986, which featured characters and a story that was completely unrelated to the 1984 Ghostbusters movie. But taking all of this into account, this may have you wondering how copyright-wise this was even possible. Well, we need to go even further back in time to 1975, where Filmation would release a live-action show featuring this same Ghostbusters for the first time, a full 9 years before Peter Venkman & Co. would appear for the first time. When Columbia Pictures started producing their 1984 movie, they neglected the fact that this property even existed. So upon learning about it, they would strike a deal with Filmation for $500,000 to use the at the time dead license name. After the success of the movie, Filmation became keen to make a TV series based around the new movie. However, after failing to procure the rights, they just made a Ghostbusters cartoon around their own Ghostbusters brand instead, which would later result in the Columbia Pictures related animated TV show being christened The Real Ghostbusters, which would be produced by Dick. But considering that this Ghostbusters predates this Ghostbusters, the name The Real Ghostbusters is a complete lie, The dick people were literally lying to children with the name of this one. Filmation Lou Scheimer later admitted we should have asked for the animation rights for their Columbia's Ghostbusters as part of the original $500,000 settlement. In terms of the world of video games, like the Ghostbusters 1984 movie, the Real Ghostbusters animated show would receive a video game to call its own, which first hit arcades in 1987, 2 years before the release of the second Ghostbuster movie. When it came to the original Activision 1984 game, and its Western release on the NES in 1988, it was not the Ghostbusters home experience that many gamers had envisioned. By this point, gamers in America were used to simplistic run and guns and platformers that took advantage of the NES's simple 2-button layout. This Ghostbusters game though was developed in an era where the Commodore 64 was picking up speed, looking to become the world's most popular gaming platform. So the whole game was pretty much programmed to cater to function best on that hardware, meaning it was a game more suitable for keyboard owners rather than simple joypad owners. So that is why the game does not feel anything like most other NES titles. Further to this, the game feels even more alien to what one would expect, because Activision employees were forced to complete the programming work in only 6 weeks, in contrast to their usual several months of development time for a game. To get around this massive issue, they would just take an existing rough concept they had for a driving maze game to be called Car Wars, and it was decided to just tweak that project and slap a Ghostbusters logo on it. So the game is so vastly different to everything else on the NES because it basically is just a random Commodore 64 game that had nothing to do with the Ghostbusters or the NES's target audience. But what for the Real Ghostbusters game? That must be more authentic, right? Let's find out. Rather than coming from Activision, the Real Ghostbusters game would be developed by Data East over in Japan. The game starts up with playing the iconic Ghostbusters theme and gives simple instructions on what the player must do on the game's attract screen. The objective is simple: capture the ghosts, collect keys, save the city. Once action starts, you will quickly notice that the Real Ghostbusters is a shoot 'em up played from an overhead perspective that is loosely based on the animated series of the same name. This means that gameplay in this one is much closer in line with what the average console gamer would have wanted to experience in 1987. The complexity of the original has been removed and replaced with simple shooty fun. Rather impressively, for the year this game was released, the game could be played 3-player cooperatively. It seems pretty undefined with regards to which Ghostbuster is meant to be which, but considering they are all the same skin tone, you can play as any of the Busters except Winston, who the Japanese team left out the game. I guess it was slightly less work to just palette swap one of the sprites' clothes, rather than their skin colour too. Action in the first stage sees the players busting their way across very tall building rooftops, taking out various weird ghosts and ghouls along the way. The characters are all armed with both guns and proton beams. Creatures can be shot with either weapon to transform them into ghosts. The ghosts can then be zapped with the proton beam to store them in the player's backpack. Ammunition for the guns is unlimited, while the proton beam has a limited charge, which is displayed at the top of the screen. Throughout a playthrough, various items can be collected to make your experience easier. This includes Ghostbuster logos that increase the firepower of players' guns, traps that can be used to refill players' energy gauges to be able to use more energy beams, potions that create auras to gain temporary invincibility, and Slimer icons when, if collected, make him float around the player, shielding them from enemy attacks. Further to this, there are also skulls that should be avoided due to draining players' energy beams. The end of the first stage sees players take on 2 large ghosts, where after hitting them with more energy than usual, they drop a key which opens a door to clear the stage. This theme repeats as players progress from stage to stage throughout the game. Speaking of the stages, between the action, scenes are shown of the characters putting ghosts into storage. These breaks basically show how many ghosts each individual player has managed to collect themselves. Throughout the game, players must play through 10 different stages, although the themes of the stages seem to repeat a bit as gamers make their way through. We have the rooftop stages as already covered, earthy ground stages, spooky graveyard sort of stages, and a little bit more variety. But things do get rather repetitive at times, including actual stage bosses themselves repeating too. On the plus side, some of the stages are not completely simply about charging forward, as some will require players to move from left to right to find level exits. Overall, the game is very short and can be beaten in just 20 minutes, offering fairly rudimentary gameplay and nothing particularly spectacular. But at the very least, this Ghostbusters experience is closer in line to what players would expect from the brand than the game that was based on Car Wars before this. Despite all of this, I would still argue that one of this game's biggest issues was that it still could have felt a lot closer to the source material. For example, it makes no sense really to publish a Ghostbusters game in 1987 where players do not get to face off against the Marshmallow Man. The game could still feel more like the Real Ghostbusters animated series too. Now we know the Real Ghostbusters TV show was not the Real Ghostbusters TV show, so it will probably come as no surprise to you that this was not a real Ghostbusters game either. And much like the previous Ghostbusters game that was really Car Wars, the real Ghostbusters title was really a Japanese game known as Mikkyu Hunter G, which got reskinned and jigged about a bit for Western markets. While the Japanese game is different in some ways to Ghostbusters, it still was not changed that drastically and indicates why neither Ghostbusters games that were released thus far were quite as Ghostbustery as they perhaps should have been, despite this one being slightly closer than the first effort. As mentioned at the start of this video, this is the Ghostbusters game that many of us would have experienced in Europe, as the game was published by Activision to every home computer format under the sun. The game would receive 5 different ports, appearing on the Amiga, Amstrad CPC, Atari ST, Commodore 64 and of course the ZX Spectrum. It is interesting to go back in time and see how these games were received. Critics on the whole were rather split with regards to what this game and its ports managed to deliver players. Many would even debate that the 1984 original game was much better. Ace magazine reviewed the Atari ST and ZX Spectrum versions and considered them to be an accurate reproduction of the arcade game, but he criticised the graphics, the collision detection, the gameplay and the confusing perspective. Zap64 criticised the graphics and the sound of the C64 and Amiga versions, while also criticising the latter version for poor collision detection. The games machine considered the colour scheme of the Amstrad CPC version unattractive, and stated that the Atari ST version was as unimpressive as the Amiga version. The ST version was criticised for its animation, crude music and sound, and janky movements, with the conclusion that it would only appeal to real Ghostbusters fans. Which, going back to everything we have discussed today, what the bloody hell even are real Ghostbusters fans? Crash, on the other hand, loved this game, calling it addictive and highly enjoyable, praising the graphics, music and gameplay. Gordon Hamlet of Your Amiga considered the graphics to be adequate, considering it an average shoot-'em-up game. Reception was a mixed bag overall, but many people still considered this game and its ports to be delivering gamers the best Ghostbusters gaming experience thus far. Personally, I think gameplay-wise this game is what it is. It delivers nothing spectacular, but I personally believe that it offers an action-orientated experience closer to what many consumers wanted than with the first game's effort. Still though, when you break it down, calling this game the real Ghostbusters video game is the biggest lie that Activision and Data East could have told players. Not only is the license stuck to the game not really the real Ghostbusters license, but the game itself was not made to be an actual Ghostbusters game. And it was not even the first Ghostbusters game to be available in the home either. Nothing about this game is real, and it may possibly be the most ironically named game in all of history. To be honest, I love all this confusing silliness, and I guess at the very least the game was closer to being real Ghostbusters material than this embarrassing abomination, which was so poorly made that I feel bad right now even reminding people that this movie exists. What stupid freaking idiots greenlit this one? At least there are plenty of better Ghostbusters media pieces out there to enjoy, and to be fair, this game is certainly amongst it all. Yeah. So ladies and gentlemen, that was the story of the real Ghostbusters, a game sold on a complete lie. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of today's video and other titles you would like me to provide deep dive content on. I would be curious to hear your thoughts. All content uploaded on this channel is made possible in part due to the generous people who back this channel over on Patreon, allowing me to work on videos full time. In return, I now offer one exclusive documentary style video each week over on the Patreon platform for my most die-hard supporters to enjoy. So for just $5 a month, you can access my growing exclusive Patreon-only library. Speaking of patrons, huge thank yous go out to Sebastian Velez, Carl Johnson, The Murder of Crows, Heyo Paula Lopez, Joseph Razmik, Corey Imar Sr., Capcom vs SNK, BXL Gotham, Ryan Dinch, Evan Balder, Philip Namph, Kamba Rambo 82, Azra Rarakai, Keith Ferguson, Jotkin Varela, Prince Knight, Michael Cullix, Ego, Jordan Durant, Angel Light 85, Alethea Swanson, Timothy W. Haskins II, Nick Daniels, Princess Zana, Glennie Glenn, Daniel Daly, Computer Man, House of the Ted, Gary Pinkett, ECU Professor, Kid Anime, Justin Wang, Aaron McNamara, Hermes Gonzalez, Instant Gratification Monkey, Man Shovel, James Bishop, JB, Posty XL, Michael Hall, Wesley Sanghi, Ben Dover, Langston Miller, Noob, Brian Barry, Stephen Lewis, Sarah Powell, Flaming Renee, Marvin O'Liga, Chris Cool, TOG Driver, Adrian Hannington, Bernard NG, Richard Stu Stewart, James McDonald, Crazy Yarl, Dan Van Dammit, Adam Castin, Lewis Viant, John Bates, David Bow, Chris Fisk, Paul Elliott, Mean Machine Dean, Mike Bruno, Rick67, Antonio Rodriguez, Hans Christian, Craig Jenkins, Tom Elliott, Retroverse.com, Casey Wright, Synth Spaces, Zai, Gunther Hendricks, and all of my other patrons. I would like to thank you all very much for continuing to allow me to do what I do. Yeah. Cheerio.